All right, now, today's topic is theory of supply. And here's where, again, I want to highlight how we're doing things that are a little bit different from what other students and other principles of economics classes are doing. One of the things that happens in other econ classes is they often present supply and demand like in the first week or two, and start working with the functions and kind of how they operate and how we shift them around. But when it's presented in that particular way, students don't get to see, and this is often intentional, all of the mechanics, all of the things that go into a supply and demand function, all of the assumptions that are in there. And so the method we've used in this course is to do it a little bit different, whereby we build up both the demand side and the supply side of the market, sort of in a step-by-step fashion. We keep adding more and more to it until we get to the model of perfect competition, and we talked about sort of the mechanics of the market demand and how that comes from individuals deciding, how much of apples versus oranges to purchase, how to maximize their utility. We thought about how firms maximize profit, and so we built up this sort of system that then enables us to see, I hope all of you, better how the supply function is thought of, where it comes from, and what it's based on. Okay, and so now we're at the point where we can talk about supply and demand in a sort of complete way, understanding and knowing that there's a lot of assumptions that go into building up these particular supply and demand curves. Now, a lot of times in the future, we're now going to use these supply and demand curves to analyze a bunch of different market situations. But we're going to have to recognize that these supply and demand curves, especially the upward sloping supply curve that we derived recently, that this is based on the assumptions of perfect competition. And we need to recognize that those are pretty strong assumptions, unrealistic in many ways, but functional and useful in terms of helping us understand, first and foremost, kind of how a perfect economy would work. And then a little bit later on in the course, we're going to be looking at how deviations away from perfect competition can actually open up a role for government and give arguments for why the government can and should perhaps step in order to help the economy function more effectively. Okay, but in order to get to those kind of more interesting questions, we need to really understand how supply and demand works. And that's our purpose this week, essentially, is to focus on the supply side of the market and to look at the mechanics of supply. Okay, so today we're going to focus our attention on deriving a supply function again and how the supply function will shift in response to changes in other variables that might affect the production decisions of individual firms. All right, then derived from assumptions of perfect competition. The second point is what I was just emphasizing. All of that is contained within that supply function. And so you should recognize every time you put a supply curve up on a diagram, you're imagining that there are many, many firms that are competing against each other in that marketplace, that each firm is too small to affect the market price, that the good is homogeneous, that there's perfect information and no deception, profit maximizing is taking place by the firms, so forth and so on. All of those assumptions that we made in the past are contained and presumed in that upward sloping supply function. And all of the stuff we talked about vis-a-vis demand and how individuals decide how to maximize their utility and trading, Smith and Jones trading apples and oranges, that's all contained within the demand curve as well. So all of those assumptions we've talked about and the models we've built up are still functional inside of the supply and demand curve. And I really want to emphasize that. It's also interesting that this grand set of assumptions that we've got can be reduced to two simple functions that cross. A supply and demand function crossing each other, determining a price and a quantity. That's everything gets reduced down to that simple diagram. And then we can use that diagram to analyze different changes in the economy. And when we're doing it, we're maintaining all of those assumptions that we made in the past, which is, I think, pretty cool. And it's powerful and it's useful and it's functional for us. Now, the last bullet point I have down here on the bottom, I want to emphasize that there is, if you have a monopoly, and if somebody asks you the question, what does a supply curve look like for a monopoly? The answer is really, there is no supply function for a monopoly. We did the monopoly case already, but remember that what a monopolist can do is they can determine the price in the market themselves through their own actions. They can just set whatever price they want. Monopolies don't function in the way of, let's give the monopoly a price and see how much they would produce. That's not the exercise a monopoly is going through. They're saying, hey, I control the market. I can set whatever price I want to set. And I'm going to do that in order to maximize my profitability. So there is no supply function, no supply curve if we're talking about a monopoly. The same thing is true for an oligopoly in general, because oligopolies too have a small number of firms with market power, and they do have some control over the price that prevails in the marketplace. Okay, so we don't sort of give the oligopoly a price and then determine how much they would produce. Again, that system only prevails when we've got perfect competition, where we've got lots and lots of firms operating in a market. Then we can say, if the price is thus and such, the supply will be something else. Okay, we've got to have that competitive market in order to talk about a supply function. Okay, let's go forward. The market supply function. Okay, here's my hand-drawn specification of a supply function. So let's start off on the left-hand side here, up and above. I've got S, and sometimes I can write supply, the quantity supplied, as a variable S, and sometimes we'll talk about demand being the variable D, and you can do that if you want. Or you can talk about the quantity being supplied and write it this way, Q sub S, to refer to the quantity supplied. And then if we're talking about demand, of course, we would write it as Q sub D for the quantity demanded in the marketplace. Either of those is okay. You can use either terminology. Now, the supply of a particular product, and I've got a name up here, coffee, and it could be coffee, or it could be butter, or it could be, you know, aircraft, passenger aircrafts, or whatever. But it actually should be something that's supplied in a close to a competitive marketplace. So agricultural goods tend to fit the bill quite well. Now, I'm going to say that supply, we will say that supply is a function. And instead of using F, which is the function name I use for the demand, I'm using G for the function name instead. And notice I've got G with parentheses here. And that means supply is a function of a number of different variables that are listed here. Price, input prices, technology, future prices, and the number of sellers in the marketplace. All right, so in general, we can just say that supply in the marketplace is going to be influenced or affected by changes in these other variables in particular ways. Now, the direction of the effects, how changes in the price of the good, for example, will affect supply, is written up here at the top of each variable. So the plus here on top of the price means that as the price goes up, there's a positive relationship between that and the effect on the supply in the marketplace. Supply curve slopes upward. And so we have a positive relationship on price that's listed there. Okay, we've already talked about that relationship and noted that the supply curve itself comes from the summation of the marginal cost curves. Down here we can see in the graph a supply function that's plotted, upward sloping. And notice that I've got it written here as the summation of the inverse of the marginal cost. Remember, marginal cost is going to be measured on this axis here. So if we added up marginal cost without the -1, we'd be adding things up this way. Okay, and I don't want to do that. I want to add up marginal cost in the other direction along the horizontal or quantity axis. And in order to do that, we need to have the little minus sign up here. Okay. A technical point, this is not that important or noteworthy. Okay, let's move on to the other things that are affecting supply. And this is where we're going to get into more action and more sort of stories that can be told about the market effects. Okay, the next important variable that's listed here is input prices. And here we recognize that the supply of a particular product is going to depend on, you're going to have to buy up lots of intermediate goods, and lots of factors of production are going to be needed to produce the product that you're supplying, coffee, for example. So produce coffee, you're going to need to hire workers, and workers need to be paid a price. That price is called the wage, for example. You're going to need to own some land, perhaps, or maybe pay rental rates to the owners of a land in order to plant and harvest coffee on it. And the rental rates, the rental payments that you're going to have to make to the owners of the land is going to be an input price, a price of a good you're going to have to purchase for the production process. You're going to have to purchase intermediate goods, maybe equipment and machinery, and maybe coffee seeds that can be planted and create coffee plants that will ultimately produce coffee beans and so forth. All right, and you're going to have to pay for the inputs of all of those things. And those are all affecting your costs of production. And thus, it's affecting your average cost and the marginal cost, which is a prime determinant of the supply function right here. So what we're going to argue and point out here is that input prices are going to be negatively related. Negative sign up here above IP means that there's a negative relationship between the prices of the inputs in the production process and the supply of the product itself. Now here we can think about it mostly as corresponding to shifts in the supply either upward or downward, because changes in input prices are affecting the marginal costs of production. And if input prices were to go up, then that's going to be reflected in the fact that supply is going to shift upward because inputs are more expensive. The costs are going to go up, in other words, marginal costs, measured again on this axis here on the left-hand side. Marginal costs go up as your input prices go up in the production process. So if wages go up, for example, for your workers, then the supply function here is going to shift in an upward direction. Now notice that if supply shifts up like that, it also looks as though the supply is shifting to the left. And that's very true. So we could think of this as either causing a leftward shift in supply is going down, or in this case, it's just kind of more intuitive to recognize that input prices affect costs. Costs are measured vertically, and so supply is going to shift up or down in response to changes in those input prices. Again, the negative relationship also means that if input prices were to go down, then supply is going to go up. Positive relationship, and we're going to have this kind of movement downward for lower costs and rightward for the shift in supply, essentially both in the same direction. Okay, let's move onward. The next variable in question is technology. All right, and this is one that we don't really measure very effectively. You can't really, the price of an input like the wage rate you pay your workers and its effect on your cost of production, monitored, kept track of by accountants, reported to your stockholders, all of that is very easy to measure. But the level of technology, this has to do with how effective your machinery is and your equipment and your organizational skills and all of those things. That corresponds to your technology in production. And we're just going to make sort of a simple relationship here and imagine we could measure that somehow, and also recognize that an improvement in technology, meaning a positive effect here, is going to tend to cause an increase in supply. And the reason for that is also a cost-related effect. So if technology improves, what we imagine is that you could then produce the same amount of the quantity, but at a lower cost, okay? And that's, in essence, what we mean by, so the input prices of the things have not changed, but because your machinery is more effective, because your organizational skill is more effective, you're able to lower the resource costs necessary to produce a particular output. And so an improvement in technology is going to have the same kind of impact here. Supply is going to shift downward because the costs, marginal costs, are going to go down with an improvement in technology. But now, here's what's tricky. Supply is shifting down measured on the vertical axis, but it's shifting rightward in terms of the horizontal axis. So when we talk about the technology effect on supply here, it's a positive relationship because supply is moving to the right, essentially, as costs come down. See how this gets confusing? So again, we have to constantly remember what's on the horizontal axis, and if we're talking about changes in supply, we're talking about rightward and leftward movements horizontally. And if we're talking about changes in costs, we're talking about movements up or down on the diagram because that's where costs are measured on the vertical axis. Because this supply function here is the supply, the quantity supplied. We're measuring it on the horizontal axis. So these variable changes that we're listing are essentially always talking about rightward or leftward shifts of supply, because that's being measured on this axis. I don't know, I feel like I'm making this more complicated than it is, but I'm trying to be extremely explicit to try to eliminate any confusions that might come up in the near future. Okay, but that's the nature of the issue that we've got going on here. Now, let's move on to the other two variables real quick. The market model as presented in a standard textbook like we're doing here also complicates the model sometimes by introducing the element of time. And when we talk about future effects and anticipation of future effects and how it affects decisions today, that incorporates this time element into the marketplace. Now, technically speaking, we don't really have time in our supply and demand model. That supply and demand function and the equilibrium we're going to talk about later, all of that is imagining to take place at a point in time, or maybe a short period of time, the market today or the market this month. But we're not really imagining this market over a long period of time. But we can in a simple way, and we're doing that by inclusion of this particular variable, future price, into the supply function itself. And here the story goes as follows. So the future price is, and again, its own price. So it's the price of coffee we're talking about. And we're imagining producers in a market now trying to make a decision about how much to supply to the market today based on their anticipation or expectation of what the price of coffee will be in the future. And here's how the story would go. Let's suppose that coffee producers or sellers, for whatever reason, I don't have a good story here, but they imagine that the price of coffee next month is going to be considerably higher than it is today. Okay? Price is going to go up. And let's just exaggerate it. Let's make it a big price change so that we can well imagine that everybody's going to respond to it. Okay, well, if the price is going to be higher tomorrow and you've got a bunch of coffee that's available for sale today, you have a choice. You could put it up for sale today and sell it at the price today that's prevailing today, or you could hold it back. You could store it in your warehouse for a month, and you could wait and then supply it to the market, not until next month when you anticipate the price is going to be higher. Okay, so what happens? If you expect the price is going to be higher tomorrow, then we ask, what would you do to the supply of the product today? The answer is, I would lower the supply to the market today and wait until I could sell it at a higher price. That's how I would maximize my profits over a long period of time. And that's why we have above FP here, negative relationship listed. If the price goes up in the future, we expect it to be higher, then supply of the product goes down today. Okay? And if the price goes down or is expected to go down in the future, then get your product sold today because the price is high and you would rather recoup a bigger price, get a bigger price for your product than a lower price in the future. Now, I will also point out that this future price variable is the only variable that we have that is affecting both supply and demand. You'll see that in just a minute when we put these two together, okay? So this is the variable that's going to both affect the supply of the market and the demand for the market simultaneously. And it then incorporates some problems in terms of determining definitively what kind of outcome will come about for changes in expected prices. All right, but it's in there, and we'll have a few exercises relating to it later on. Now, the last variable in the mix here is the number of sellers in the market. And this is kind of getting at that long run effect of entry and exit of firms in the larger sense and how that affects the market supply. So we saw that in the long run, for example, entry is going to cause the number of sellers to go up. Okay, NS is going to go up with entry in response to positive profits of the firms in the industry. Okay, but as the number of sellers goes up, well, it's going to positively affect the market supply by shifting it to the right. So positive relationship here between the number of sellers and the total supply to the market economy. All right, now here I've got listed the changes that are going to tend to cause a rightward shift of the supply curve or a downward shift, depending on how you want to interpret it. And again, the first two can be thought of causing downward shifts, and the second two can be thought of as causing rightward shifts. But in the end, it's all the same. It's all going to move the supply curve in the same direction, and it's going to have the same effect upon the market. Okay, so decreases in input prices, increases in technology, decreases in future price expectations, and increases in the number of sellers are all going to cause the supply function in the market to shift to the right, let's say, and the opposite is going to cause the alternative shift to the other direction. Now, you'll notice that I didn't mention the price of the product itself. The price itself is going to correspond to shifts along the supply curve. All right, if you change the price, because it's already plotted up here on the left-hand side, it's on the vertical axis. So we're already incorporating in the supply function itself the relationship between the own price and the supply of firms in the marketplace. So it's not going to cause shifts. Only these variables on the right are going to cause shifts.